everybody, and so I talk about working with natural heritage, but I'm guessing that a lot of you aren't necessarily working with natural heritage, but you're working on projects that may have an impact on natural heritage. And often we think, we get so involved in a particular aspect of heritage, we might forget about some of the other aspects, and inadvertently we can have a negative impact on it. So I suppose this is just a talk really just to make you aware of things to think about when you're working on heritage projects and thinking, as I said, about the natural heritage. And the term biodiversity was mentioned earlier, so biodiversity and natural heritage are really interchangeable. So we're just talking about nature, wildlife, the natural environment, that sort of thing. So I'm going to do very briefly on the legal stuff, but it's really more about what to be aware of and where to ask, I mean, that's the thing. We can't all be legal experts or go into the nitty-gritty of the legislation, but it's where to find the relevant information. And just to hear what Dan was saying, really, is to have a plan, have a good plan and good advice to implement that plan, make sure that people who are implementing the plan know what the plan is and know that the important heritage aspects that we're trying to protect, so that we have really high quality projects and sustainable projects at the end. So I just wanted to think a little bit about the kind of projects that you may or may not be involved in. We've seen other examples before from Wexford. Wexford, there's some projects where there's a very direct sort of natural heritage element. So if you're developing sort of walking routes or river walks or trails, that sort of thing, or natural amenities, that sort of thing, where there's an obvious kind of, the natural environment is there and there's also potential to highlight where they've got an impact. You might be doing more sort of built heritage projects, like what Dan was maybe talking about, restoring old structures, old industrial architecture, inherited, that sort of thing. But there might be a natural heritage element, even though that's not your focus. So, old buildings can be very important for nesting birds, things like barn owls, like hiding out in some old structures. There might be bats, or there might be a small stream or something that is close to the monument that you're working on, that may be important for water quality, might be important to aquatic habitat. So even though your focus is the built heritage, there might be important natural heritage there as well. You might be doing something like interpretive signage. You might think that's going to really be a big deal. It's really straightforward. And there's some really nice examples of interpretive signage out there that whether they're highlighting the natural heritage or the built heritage. But there are some cases where you might have a lovely plan to put in signage, but again you might need to stop and think, is this going to have a negative impact or take away from the things that we're highlighting? There's a lovely example on your left. The other example, with the best will in the world, they put up all the signage on a river in Galway, but without realising it, just even putting in the signs, concrete bases in an aquatic environment. Concrete is never a good thing when you're working anywhere near aquatic habitats or wildlife. But also, there was an invasive species there, the giant hogweed. I don't know if you're familiar with that one. Really nasty, spreads really easily, really harmful for the people actually working there. And they disturbed the whole area where there was this hogweed. So even though you might think that putting up signage really could have huge amount of implications, in some cases you really need to stop and think before you do it. Restoring old graveyards, and we saw a pretty awful example of, again, with the best will in the world, and again, often on graveyards you're thinking about the cultural heritage, the built heritage, but they can also be hugely important places for wildlife because they're typically quiet, undisturbed structures, maybe old trees. Again, there could be important nesting habitats for birds, for bats. There could be rare plants. Or you might be doing something that really you might think has absolutely nothing to do with natural heritage or the natural environment, building a heritage centre, a community centre, playground, any kind of community facilities, But if you're going through the planning process, you'll soon realise that if there is a site designated for nature conservation in the surrounding area, you might be required to do an ecological assessment that will add to your costs, So, really, no matter what you're doing at the very onset, when you're starting to think about the process, or planning, you do need to think, is there, whether it's a natural heritage project or any other kind of project, is there a chance that it could impact on the natural environment or biodiversity? Is this going to be something that, again, I'm going to need permissions or consents or a survey? And I suppose, just to stop and think that the why, why do we have to do this? And you often see, sort of negative headlines in newspapers, but why is there a slug in the way or a bird or something that's, stalling my project or adding to cost? And I suppose, natural heritage or biodiversity is life and it supports life. We depend on the natural environment. It supports our agriculture, it supports forestry, pest and disease control, pollination. A lot of the natural environment, wetlands, all these habitats, woodlands, maintain water quality. They are part of our natural flood capacity and regulation. They have huge impact on our quality of life and hugely important. We're marketing Ireland on its kind of, the Wild Atlantic Way is a big thing, on its sort of natural environment. So we need to look after our natural heritage because it supports so many sectors in our economy and has such impact on society. So oftentimes people think that they're a small little project. Well, why does that need all these kind of permissions, consents? But it's a cumulative effect of all these little things can have a really, really big impact on the natural environment. I'm living in Galway and I remember only too well all the flooding we've had the last couple of years, and we're all up in arms about it. But, if we don't look after our natural environment, these are the consequences, water quality issues, flooding issues, and again, consequences for agriculture and all the rest of it. So it is hugely important that we look after our natural environment. That's the plug. So I suppose I'm not going to go into the detail of the legislation, and I suppose that the take-home message is to pick up the phone and ring the National Parks and Wildlife, the local officer, who they're the body really that has the overarching job of kind of regulating and protecting nature. And I have some kind of contact details at the end. But just the kind of things to look out for, and just to think there's kind of the national legislation and the European legislation. And I suppose just to realise that all birds are protected under our national legislation. I suppose as importantly, and their nesting habitats, or birds that are nesting. Okay? All native mammals are also protected, and that includes obviously bats. Now obviously there's game species and there's hunting seasons and all the rest of it, so there are some exceptions, but it's just important to realise that all birds and wildlife and mammals are protected. Certain plants, now a lot of times the plants that are protected are very rare species. They tend to be in out of the way places, so they don't cause too many problems. It's more things like roosting bats in old buildings, or birds, nesting birds, that sort of thing that you might actually come, that might be an issue for you. And I suppose the implications are, it's not so much that you can't do something, it's really about kind of working with nature, and just, again, if you have a good plan, timing your works so that it's not going to have a negative impact. So it doesn't have to be a huge hurdle, but as I said, consulting at an early stage, finding out what is there, what do I need to do so that I can still do the project that I want to do, or I can tweak it, put in a few mitigation measures so that we get a good quality project but we don't have a negative impact. So oftentimes it's just, as I said, doing things outside of the nesting season or doing it in a different way so that you're not having an impact on wildlife. You might have rare species, you might have iconic species, you might have important things that are really all part of the local heritage. It could add to your project, might become something that you're highlighting in the end. Bats are again something, if you're doing some built heritage projects, working with old buildings, they do the kind of work where they do tend to like roosting in old buildings and old stonework, and also in big veteran trees. So again, it's just finding, are they there, and just timing the works. With bats, they have their summer roosts and then their hibernation roosts. So it's just getting that bit of information. And you'll just keep me saying consult, consult, consult. Pick up the phone, I always think is the easiest thing to do. And talk to your local National Parks and Wildlife ranger. They can be a bit tricky to pin down, but just, keep at it. Also the heritage officers and the biodiversity officers. If you're lucky, there's a biodiversity officer, but there's heritage officer in most local authorities. They're a fantastic resource. They're kind of like a signpost. They'll point you in the right direction of who to ask. And as I said, you may be lucky. You might be doing one thing and discover that you've got this iconic species on your door. So this is down in Mount Shannon, where they're making great hay out of the white-tailed sea eagles, and it's become a huge benefit to the local economy. Bird watching is a thing, and it really just sort of, almost by chance, so you might turn up something very special. So that's kind of protected species to be aware of that under national legislation. There's also protected sites. Now it does get a little bit confusing. There's like alphabet soup with all the different abbreviations of terminology, but we're trying to keep it reasonably straightforward. Under national legislation, we have the certain protected sites. So it's things like the national parks around the country, the nature reserves. Most of those are state-owned, so they're straightforward enough. They're very well protected. But there's also the natural heritage areas. Does that ring a bell for a few people? The NHAs. So they're protected under Irish legislation, so they're important in an Irish context. And many of them don't have full statutory protection. They're what they call proposed NHAs, but they usually are protected under planning legislation in county development plans. So, if you're going for planning, you might be asked to do an ecological survey, or you might need to show that you're not going to have a negative impact. And the same thing again, consult with Parks and Wildlife and find out what you need to do or how you need to do it so that you're not going to have an impact. Just a couple of other things under national legislation, and it's all in the news at the minute about hedge cutting. It's illegal to cut hedgerows during bird nesting season. And for good reason. We've had huge impact on our countryside birds from hacking the living daylights out of hedgerows. So do it in the winter. It's much more efficient. You'll get a much better kind of outcome, as well as you won't have an impact. And that also applies to things like if you're taking ivy off structures. Do it outside of the bird nesting season. If it's a historic or important structure, get your architectural advice as well. And it also applies to broad-scale spraying of herbicides, which people seem to like doing on hedgerows or to control vegetation as well, which again is not really allowed under the Wildlife Act. Trees, if you're taking down trees, just ring the county forestry inspector, because you do need a felling license. If it's a big old tree, again, think about the timing. If it has to come down and you've got the permission, do it in the winter time and you won't impact on birds or bats. And invasive species, now I'm really running through these because there's just so much. But hopefully a lot of you are aware about the problem with invasive species, things that are introduced to Ireland that are causing a big problem here. This is a very common roadside one, the Japanese knotweed. It's illegal to spread it. Now, I know none of you are actively going around spreading it, but by cutting it or digging it up or doing works around Japanese knotweed, you are inadvertently bringing soil from one place to the other. It grows through tarmac and concrete. You don't want it making really big headache for you in years to come. So if you have it, this is when you really need advice. And it's not, you can't just sort of push it under the carpet. It'll come back to haunt you, so you do need to deal with it. So moving speedily on to the European legislation. And here we're talking about a really high level of protection. We're talking about the most important species and habitats. And these are important not just in an Irish context, but in a European context. So these have a very high level of protection. And again, we get a bit kind of complex with the language and all the terminology. But basically, again, we've protected species and protected sites. So if a species is protected under European legislation, it really has a high level of protection. And I've put in a couple of examples, otters and frogs, which you might say to me, they're quite common in Ireland, but in the European context, they are hugely threatened and have declined hugely. And I suppose it's just a reflection that we have a relatively unspoiled, healthy environment, that we do have a lot of rivers that still have otters. They're very rare in other countries. This is something we should be delighted about. And same with poor old frog, or birds like the hen harrier. So it's the same thing. It's consulting with Parks and Wildlife. Are these things in and around where you're working? Again, oftentimes it's about just timing of your work. So there might be some cases where there's a really important species and you really can't do what you want to do, or you might have to do it in a very different way. But in many cases, it's about doing it at a certain time so you're not going to disturb them. And as I said, with the plants, they tend to be off on cliffs and in far away places. So it's rarely that you have a protected plant or rare plant, but it may be there. But it's consult again. Then there's the protected sites, and these are the ones that you've probably heard about as well. The special areas of conservation, or the SACs, and the special protection areas, or the SPAs. And again, these are the best sites from a kind of a wildlife or a nature conservation perspective in the whole of Europe. So these are the jewels in the crown, if you know, and they're just kind of a sample of particular habitats or places for particular species throughout Europe. So these are very special places. And again, their special areas of conservation are designated based on particular habitats or species of really high conservation value, whether so there might be bogs or woodland or rivers, that sort of thing. The SPAs, the special protection areas, are for birds. Okay? And I suppose the implications of these, previously if you've got an NHA or a species protected under national legislation, you might need an ecological survey. The local authority might ask for that if you're going for planning. With the European sites, the legislation requires that if there's any possibility that works that you're doing, a plan or a project or anything you might be doing, might have an impact on these European sites, these SPAs or SSC, you are required to do an appropriate assessment, which is a term you may or may not have come across. So there may be a more significant cost involved. And really that appropriate assessment, I'm not going to go into nitty-gritty because we could talk all day on it, is just to screen out projects to see, is there a possibility that there's going to be an impact? In many cases, there isn't, and you're fine, and off you go. In some cases, it might be you really need further ecological assessment, or you may need to change your project or to mitigate against what the damage that might be done. Okay, so this is something, again, you really want to know this at the very beginning. Pick up the phone, ask your heritage officer, the National Parks and Wildlife Ranger, is this something that I need to do? Because if you can incorporate it into your budget at the beginning, and it's not going to be a red flag that comes up halfway through the project. And so the problem is it that you might be doing your project somewhere in County Dublin, and you might think, well, I'm nowhere near anywhere that's important for nature conservation, but the legislation requires you to think within a 15-kilometre radius, are there any sites? Which is huge, so you really have to think about it. You may be off somewhere, but you might have a river on your site, the downstream there could be impacts, so you really need to think wide, and that's in the consultation. Again, there's fantastic resource. The National Parks and Wildlife website is greatly improved, or the Heritage Maps site over yonder. And it shows you where these designated sites are. It shows you where what protected species might be in your area. You can search very easily. All those little shadings are the special areas of conservation or special protection areas. This is just zooming into where we are right now. And you can see we're on Wood Quay, but downstream there's the Dublin Bay, there's protected sites. So anything you do, say, in buildings around here, might have an impact on a site downstream. But my plug for Heritage Maps, the National Biodiversity, there's loads of resources out there. I still think picking up the phone in the first instance and then doing a bit of Googling and searching, that you can get great information that really was much more tricky to do only a year or so ago. It's much easier now. And you can look at your specific site and get all that information very easily. And as I said, the potential pathways where you might have an impact, you might think I'm miles and miles from something important, but generally, water is one of the most important issues because there's huge concern for impacts on water quality, because that can have an impact on biodiversity, but also on drinking water and then the environment. So, unless you're very isolated and there's really no kind of water bodies nearby, then you really need to maybe think, could I have a downstream impact? Are there hedgerows? Are there important habitats on my site that could support these protected species or that may have an impact on these designated sites nearby? And that's just looking at Bing Maps. You can just quickly see your local environment and kind of get an idea. And I suppose the other, just finally, the main message is it's not to panic. A lot of times it's the sort of negative connotations with nature conservation. But really, you know, there's a lot of information and advice out there. And as I said, often it's just about tweaking your project, doing it in a different way, you know, or just modifying things so that you don't have an impact. There's loads of information. You know, the Heritage Officer, Parks and Wildlife, you know, if it's water related, inland fisheries, if it's tree related, the Forest Service. And there's loads of really good environmental NGOs out there that have excellent information and databases that can give you a hand. You know, it's part of their remit to give you a hand, and that's fantastic. And I suppose the benefits are, you know, by protecting, whether it's the natural heritage or the cultural ability, is having really, really high quality projects that can really fly the flag for your area and that really show the best. And heritage isn't just something in the past, it's the heritage of the future. So you're protecting something and kind of highlighting something for the future as well. It's also having sustainable projects and projects that don't have you know, that protect the environment as well. As I said, there's loads of information out there, so hopefully, you know, it shouldn't be too onerous to kind of figure things out. Okay, thanks very much.